Kia ora everyone, hello. There's a widespread and plentiful resource potential here in our country, New Zealand. I'm talking oil and gas. I'm focusing on a process involved with oil extraction called hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it has been coined. If you haven't yet heard of this process, then keep an ear open around it in the mining and minerals and the environmental scenes. Fracking is a topical and controversial issue which ignites debate between the oil and gas industry players versus the environmentalists. The debate is strong here in New Zealand as well as overseas, and is set to become more vicious as the government becomes increasingly curious about oil exploration. So what can I add? I plan to give you all an insight into how safe, well-regulated fracking for oil and gas can have a long-term positive impact for New Zealand. The key messages I want to convey are explaining what fracking involves and why we use it, discussing why some people are worried and why they shouldn't be, and informing you of where New Zealand's potential is likely located, and from there discussing what our nation stands to gain, both economically and socially. I'll treat my presentation as a success if the majority, if not all of you, leave here open-minded, interested, and keen to find out more. So what is fracking? Fracking improves the economics and efficiency of oil and gas recovery and involves breaking the rock underground. Oil and gas, or hydrocarbons, lie trapped in natural geological reservoirs in the crust of the earth. Hydrocarbons can be found in porous host rocks such as sandstones. Fracking is mainly used in, but is not restricted to, gas deposits and especially deep shale gas deposits. Initially, a hole or well is drilled into the reservoir. Frack fluid is then pumped into the well at high pressures the surrounding rock cracks. More migration pathways are now available for the hydrocarbons. The rock is fractured or opened up on a scale of millimetres. Hydrocarbons migrate through these cracks and back to the pipeline. They're extracted through the wells and stored in tanks. Frack fluid is recovered and stored in these pits to be treated. Frack fluid is made up of 99% sand and water. Of course, I'd be insisting that the use of these two resources be well managed and regulated to high standards. The remainder of the frack fluid is fracking chemicals. In New Zealand, broadly speaking, we use 12 different kinds of fracking chemicals. A full list of these is available at nzfracking.org.nz, and please go and have a look at this. The chemicals are all considered safe under the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act 1996. The chemicals serve two key purposes. One is to keep the sand in suspension, it's effectively a thickener, and the second is to enhance the ability of the water to be pumped down quickly at high pressures. The chemicals reduce friction along the lines of a dishwash liquid. Remember, although chemical is a daunting word, we eat, drink, live and breathe chemicals. So why do we use fracking? We as in humans depend on oil. Transportation makes up around 70% of our need for oil consumption globally. Here in New Zealand, we love our clean and green image, and that in general is fair enough. We're pretty good. But currently most of our oil comes from overseas, 97% in fact. Although to our credit, we are exporting some oil of our own already. Oil production in most of our import nations is poorly regulated, corrupt, and has little respect for the environment. I'm referring to Middle Eastern countries as well as Indonesia, Russia and Nigeria, among others. We're making it someone else's problem. I believe, and I hope that some of you do too, that it would be environmentally and socially responsible for us Kiwis to produce more oil and gas of our own. We should add this oil and gas to the global supply chain. We need to cease this "it's not my problem" attitude. Fracking in the oil and gas industry enables more efficient recovery of hydrocarbon deposits. Subsequently, it enhances the economic value of these deposits. Fracking the rocks makes hydrocarbon operations more economically viable. Next on the agenda is natural gas. Our nation should aspire to have cleaner and cheaper fuel. It sets us up to propel our economy forward and reduce our emissions. It's a win-win. Global demand for oil is set to be 30% higher by 2040 than it was in 2010. We're using around 70%, as I mentioned, for travel. Reducing transport emissions is a big environmental challenge for New Zealand. Natural gas is not the overall solution. It is, however, the bridge fuel. Renewables such as wind or solar are currently too expensive. We'll eventually find a renewable system to rely on, but in the meantime, natural gas is a relatively cheap and clean solution. Natural gas is 130 octane. This means significantly higher performance than the 91, 96 and 98 octane varieties we see at our pumps. It's 25% cleaner burning than oil, and additional to this, natural gas comes from the ground at 130 octane, so it does not need a refinery. That further reduces our dependence on imported capital equipment, reduces pollutants and reduces wastewater. Natural gas becomes a much more available option if we encourage and develop fracking here in New Zealand to extract the gas. And that sounds good. So why does fracking worry the public? Problems associated with fracking often come from uninformed skeptics with little or no scientific evidence to support them. The media excites this debate. I'm sure you've seen it in other instances, kicking up the sand to cover the real truths because it makes a better story. The perceived problems are not caused by fracking in itself. They can be caused by processes associated with gas extraction. Yes, I can see that fracking has its risks. So do most things. You all took a risk to come here today. But through safe practice and regulation, like driving appropriately and not crossing the road without looking both ways, you overcame the risks. I suppose most rumours and issues around fracking arise from this 2010 documentary, Gasland by Josh Fox. For those of you who haven't seen it, Fox travels around a few American states and confronts people who claim to have serious problems with their land, health and livestock because of fracking. The film uses little science, and the director, Fox, is a New York filmmaker. He's not a scientist. There can be problems, for example, drinking water contamination, caused by the failure of pipes. We do have the technology, and it's simple technology, for good practice to avoid these problems. Where there have been problems, the problems have commonly been confined to the US's most poorly regulated states. These states' governments, I'm told, remain in power because they're anti-regulation. We know that New Zealand is not like this. We have strong, tight regulations to ensure safety and best practice. We are proactive and not reactive. Then we have the theory that fracking causes earthquakes. It's a necessary topic in New Zealand. Does fracking cause earthquakes? It does. In February of this year, GNS released a report on how seismic activity was related to hydraulic fracturing in the Taranaki region. To understand the results of this, you've got to understand that rock breaks in two ways. Tensile failure is the rock cracking under the increased fluid pressure. The tensile failure readings gave a magnitude of less than 0. Around Taranaki, the seismic instruments were getting larger readings from wave breaks than they were from earthquakes induced by hydraulic fracturing. The other type is shear failure, where increased pressure in the rock kickstarts already existing cracks or faults. If these were already close to failure, then they can slip and cause an earthquake. It can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. The earthquakes are dependent on geology and depth, and GNS estimates that the absolute maximum earthquake that could be generated by fracking in Taranaki is magnitude 2. A magnitude 2, just so you know, is 30,000 times less energetic than a magnitude 5. So what potential does New Zealand have for fracking? How can this process help us? The first step is exploration. If we allow more exploration, we will find areas of interest that would be uneconomic without the use of fracturing to increase efficiency. Industry leaders describe New Zealand as severely underexplored. We need to invest in or find global partners to help us with exploring for our resources. The next step is to build the infrastructure to drill, to frack, and to produce oil and gas. It may sound threatening to our clean green image, and it could be, but not if we can do it safely and efficiently. New Zealand's areas of interest for oil are divided up into sedimentary basins, and this image from GNS shows their locations. I'll focus on the Taranaki Basin, as it is currently New Zealand's only oil-producing basin. The fields within the basin contain mainly gas, but do produce a proportion of oil. A couple of significant fields produce predominantly oil. The Taranaki Basin had produced 400 million barrels of oil and 5,500 billion cubic feet of gas as at 2009. Reserves in our larger fields such as Maui and Tui are declining, so we need to consider continued exploration and investment in these areas. And so we arrive at my focal point. What value would the development of fracking add to New Zealand's economy? It's no secret that surviving the current global economic instability will be tough. To survive, our economy needs to move forward, to grow, to increase GDP and to pay off our debt. We must aspire to an economic surplus. The expansion of our oil and gas sector is one practical solution and could be a key component to success. Here are some areas that would benefit. In jobs, more accessible oil and gas directly and indirectly creates more jobs. This includes many highly skilled and highly paid mining and geology jobs. We currently lose such expertise to Australia. These jobs benefit the nation and our local communities through the retention of wages, salaries and contracts. The oil and gas sector is currently New Zealand's fourth largest and directly provides around 7,000 quite well-paid jobs. Then we have the government royalties. With the production of oil and gas comes the ability of our government to obtain royalties from the mining companies. The government takes 20% of net profit before tax in royalties. In 2009, the government received $511.5 million in royalties from oil and gas companies. It's a significant earning for the government, and an opportunity to grow this should of course be considered. Then there's the need for ongoing investment. Two of our larger, currently mined reservoirs, the Maui and Tui fields, are approaching the end of their production spans. New Zealand needs to recycle investment from these fields into new developments. Hydrocarbon reserves are inevitably depleted. They have a finite life. So to keep the jobs, the royalties and the other benefits going, to move the sector forward, developing fracking practices is a viable option. We have opportunities for manufacturing. As well as extracting more oil and gas, New Zealand has the potential to become an industry leader in manufacturing the equipment and technologies required. Andrew Knight, the CEO of New Zealand Oil and Gas, tells me that one of the biggest obstacles to them working in New Zealand is equipment. Manufacturing drilling equipment isn't easy or cheap. I believe that we have the ability, especially with our world-renowned Kiwi ingenuity, to lead the world in developing the safest and best technologies involved with fracking. There's clearly a market for these technologies, and it's a booming one at that. Then we have benefits to local companies. They're immense. Port Taranaki, which is 100% owned by the local council there, gain about 72 to 73% of business on tonnage from oil and gas production. In 2007, the port contributed $604 million to output, $290 million to GDP, and employed 1,485 full-time equivalents. That's 6.6% of regional employment of GDP and 3.3% of regional employment. The port has expanded its operations further since 2007, and so the figures have increased further still. But that's just the port. The report found associated industries turn over $6.3 billion, generate $2.2 billion in economic value added to the region, and employ roughly 19,000 full-time equivalents. That's 43% of local GDP and 33% of Taranaki's employment stemming from the port. As a result of the oil and gas industry and also the local dairy industry, the port has become the cornerstone of economic development in the Taranaki region. So when I asked their CFO if he could see the encouragement and development of fracking growing the local economy, his reply was simple. He said one word. He said, "Oh, absolutely." So I want you to leave here knowing that fracking improves the efficiency and economics of hydrocarbon recovery. With the engagement, encouragement and development of safe, effective fracking processes, our nation can expand our oil and gas sector, and this will lead to more opportunities for our economy and for our society. Thank you for listening.